My friends, no story ever written for the screen is as dramatic as the story of the screen itself. Tonight, we write another chapter in that story.
This is about games, but first we have to start with a story about films. The year was 1927, and something wonderful happened. The first feature motion picture with synchronized sound was released, a talkie. Or at least the first to get popular.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
The jazz singer had gripped the attention of the nation. Even if it could only be shown in 12 theaters, it was a miraculous hit. The impact was immediately felt. The silent film was dead. But what to do then with the thousands of silent films that had been created, that made up the foundation of film history? Well, to put it simply, it wasn't something many people considered. Writing a decade before, the Supreme Court Justice Garth Jowett would write into law what many believed about these new moving pictures. Exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, originated and conducted for profit like other spectacles, and not to be regarded as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion within the meaning of freedom of speech and publication guaranteed by the Constitution of Ohio. Films then weren't worthy of being protected in terms of freedom of speech, and in general they wouldn't be protected for future generations. Out of the tens of thousands of films that were created during the first 3 decades of commercialized film, we only have a small sliver left to pull from. Much of it was intentionally destroyed, grinded down for its value in silver. Others simply went up in flames.
At that time, 35mm nitrate film was so flammable that you couldn't even bring a reel onto a streetcar.
Hey, you can't bring those there in a public vehicle. They're films, ain't they?
Yes.
Then they're flammable. Go on up, off.
Because nitrate film burns 3 times faster than paper.
And beyond the dramatic, many films were not destroyed before their time. They simply did not last long enough for anyone to be interested in preserving them. Here, then, is why I'm bringing up this story. The takeaway is simple, but an important one. When there isn't interest in preserving art, art isn't preserved.
Steve and Chris, you both build computer-based games. Do you call yourselves designers or programmers?
I call myself a designer because most of the sweat and blood I expend occurs in the design phase, not in the programming phase. I spend a great deal of time worrying about what my audience will experience in the game, and only towards the end of the project do I actually get down to writing in code.
When you think about the design of the game, what are the elements of the game that make it interesting?
Well, that has to do a great deal with what I'm trying to accomplish. I set a goal. I want a game to achieve a certain effect. I want to somehow communicate a message to my audience. That message then dictates the topic and the style of the game, the nature of the graphics, the feel. That's what the texture of the game that I'm trying to build into it. That's what I spend most of my time worrying about.
Chris, you're talking more like a writer rather than a computer programmer. Steve, is that how you see what you do?
That's basically what we are. We're writers. We're writing a book, a novel, creating a vicarious universe in this computer program. We have to model everything we want, put every small detail in. Very often, in my game, for instance, I had to do extensive research for 1.5 years to understand my subject before I could distill the important aspects out and then put them into this cartridge.
Like a writer would.
Exactly like a writer would. When a writer writes a book, the book is a vicarious universe. You read it and become part of it. It's the same thing. When you play these games, these programs, you vicariously become part of the universe that the programmer puts into it.
The year is 2021. The video game industry finds itself in a parallel position as the major film companies of the past. There's little interest in preserving games history. This isn't malicious, an evil, maniacal executive destroying history for its own sake. Their focus is parallel to the old movie houses. The industry's focus is short-term, with new pictures always better than the old ones. Since films had a limited commercial life and were rapidly written off as corporate assets, any expense toward better storage or preservation would reduce current profits with no future return. One industry insider noted that the studios were in the razor business, and the films were the blades. Now, the games are the blades. Is that dumb? Add on to that the games industry doesn't have the privilege of similar tools, where one film set's camera was primarily the same one as another film set's camera. Instead, the games industry is as much about the technology as it is about the games that are created. The creation of tools for any given game is generally unique and expensive, and with that comes the willingness to protect that investment. We can see this now with the big Nintendo data leak that happened in 2020. The information found was decades old, had no bearing or perceived bearing on the games they make today. But ultimately, this is information that's kept from the public, and especially from other competitors' eyes. If a game company has it, they don't want to share it. As the years roll on, this secrecy and the general disinterest in games companies wanting to preserve their works, it leads to losing even the works themselves. Companies like Good Old Games have shown what happens when game companies are the only sources of a game's history.
When we try to sign some older titles, and we learn something about like the company does no longer exist, and you have to think like where do you trace, like how do you get a game, how do you get the game, because it's usually in legal hell. That's how starting point. Somebody used to own a company, there was some partners, the company breaks, something happened with the right, there was a publisher, we don't know what's in the agreement between the publisher and the developer, so we have no idea which things were licensed, purchased, transferred, and then it starts. You go to one meeting, another meeting, learn a little piece of things, sometimes it's lies, sometimes it's not, sometimes people just remember things differently, or we learn that there's one entity which owns the rights for the IP, and then there's another entity which owns the right for code, and there's a writing which belongs to the third party, and they don't even know each other. Right. And they have no idea that they own the thing.
They've shown the need for preservation efforts outside of these companies, many of which at some point fall apart. This isn't an old problem, this is a current problem. This is happening and will continue to happen. Even if the industry is doing its best, companies will fail. If the only person who will finally have access to these records will be the companies that buy these other companies out, what happens to those records? Are they going to take care of them? GOG has shown that there is a financial incentive to preserving these games and to keeping them alive. But ultimately, what about the games that people don't care about? That don't have these fond memories stuck in people's heads? Or simply if there just aren't the resources to track down these pieces of gaming history. What then? And this is a problem that has a timer on it. Floppy disks, CDs, old hard drives, they all have a shelf life. There isn't a lot of time left. I want to use Silent Hill 2 as kind of a case study for this. Currently, there's no legal way to purchase the game new. The only versions available are those that have already been sold, which are quite expensive, and if you can find them, they're relegated to old hardware. The most updated version of the game we have is from the Silent Hill HD collection, which was based on an in-development build of the game, as the publisher Konami, like many companies back then, simply hadn't kept the source code.
Japanese developers didn't have any practice of keeping source code after shipping in the 90s because they thought there was no value in keeping it. At that time, the main platforms were SNES and PS1. Especially in the SNES age, developers programmed games in assembly language, written for limited hardware, and it was difficult to reuse that source code. In addition, most programmers didn't want to read source code written by other programmers. In the PS1 era, program language shifted to C, and the source code could be used in other products. But the situation didn't change much because machine power was limited. It's different from Western culture because they programmed on PC, which was more versatile. This practice changed in the PS2 era in Japan, when developers started using some libraries and middlewares. In the PS3 era, they understood the value of a game engine and started to use it in their products in the multi-platform business. They started the download business after shipping, so Japanese developers more seriously started to keep source code after shipping. I agree that Konami has a secretive culture, but most Japanese developers were the same in the 90s. They focused on merging hardware power with a cool way of programming, but didn't care to keep it after shipping. In looking toward the future, they forgot about preserving the past. It's the same even now, and affects the poor video game archives in Japan. The government and academics want to keep a legacy, but most developers are hesitant.
Many would hold Silent Hill 2 up as a pinnacle of survival horror design. But for developers who want to explore the intricacies of this experience to understand how other developers have dealt with this problem, it's not necessarily feasible that someone's going to go out of their way to find an older experience. If they even know how to get one, what are they to do? Fans have resorted to finding rips of the old PC version of this game, and even going as far as to create an enhanced edition that looks to provide the best quality assets and qualities of all the versions of the game. Specifically, I mean something like the FMV movies that are night and day when you look at the PS2 version versus the PC port. Though, this is all technically illegal. I mean, Konami will probably never do anything about it, but they have the right to do so, just in the same way that companies like Nintendo have been protective of their properties and restricted the releases of their works. 3D All-Stars is not the only remake that this has been done to. What do we have access to then? Well, what the industry wants us to see. Think of the premium art books, the developer interviews done for E3, or the carefully edited documentaries, all with the goal to present the best possible face of not only the game, but the process that went into making that game. The aims of these marketing materials and those of preserving game history are not the same. When I was a kid, what it meant to develop games came from documentaries like this one, following Bethesda's 2007 game Oblivion and its run-up to E3. It gave me, even if it was a small view, a view of what it meant to make games. What did it look like to make a game? Where did they go? What were their inspirations? These were fundamental things I would have had no idea about without these materials. Though in retrospect, if you asked any creative if a 40-minute documentary would adequately reflect the experience they had working on a project that they spent years of their lives on, I'd argue they say no. E3 demos like the one created here, or for trade shows or for publishers, are a good example of the reality that's hidden when we just look at these promotional materials. These polished slices of the game are usually more reflective of longer hours, heightened stress, and a product that is not even usable after the demo has been shown. As most engineers know, demo code is almost always garbage, throwaway code, said the developer. So we got to crunch, to write code we knew was not actually feasible long term, but looked good enough for showing it off. Not only was this for trade shows like E3, but once we'd shown stuff off, we had publishers coming out, and we were trying to court them as well. The longest I had ever spent in the office was almost 30 hours. I did not sleep. We had a huge demo for a potential publisher, some division of Sony, and we had to get everything just right. I came into the office early, around 7 a.m., and I didn't leave until almost noon the next day. I went out for lunch, and I went out for breakfast around 6 a.m., but that was it, said an undisclosed developer from Symmetronics while working on their canceled project, Hero's Journey. This is the rule, not the exception, even for games that weren't canceled, like Anthem, or, maybe more surprisingly, Uncharted 4, a game that received incredible public and critical reception. I want to make clear that this is not a moral problem with these documentaries or other promotional materials. It's their goal to get you to buy a product. But, this being one of our few ways we understand the creation of video games, it does a disservice to the work the developers do, and all the decisions, the challenges, and at times hardships that certain projects find themselves dealing with. The aim of this archive, then, is to provide one of the many solutions needed to solve this problem. Not to reveal gossip, or even have an antagonistic relationship with the companies of this industry, but to provide a platform for sources that researchers, developers, and even fans can use to get a better appreciation for the experiences that have had such an impact on our lives. Another piece of this puzzle is humanizing the process of developing games. Developers, and in equal measure the managers and companies that finance these pieces of art, are human. These are people.
The problem is, the people that they are attacking, we're not movie stars. We're not trading in our own reputation. We're not trying to be the center of attention. We're just people doing our jobs. Now, they're cool jobs, and they're jobs we really love and we're passionate about on projects we love. But if things get too intense, we don't have million-dollar mansions to hide in. We don't have high-tech security systems. We're just people.
For as much as the gaming community personifies the industry with the worst intentions, these are people. Publishers like EA come to mind as receiving incredible scorn from the community at large. And I'm not trying to say that they deserve none of it, or that they're secretly good or something. We just don't know enough. We don't have all the information. We have what they give us and our preconceived notions of what it means to make a game and all the realities that entails. To illustrate this, I want to use the example of Rebecca Hyman when she worked at EA after coming from a company that is usually held in higher opinion, Interplay, the creators of the Fallout series. A company she would be a co-founder of.
Interplay was rife with toxic masculinity and misogyny, homophobia. It all came from the top. There was one incident in which one employee at Interplay in 1994 came out as transgender. I hadn't come out yet, but I was basically terrified. This person had the courage to come out and did the initial notes saying they're transgender, and then they were basically reduced in rank, and I just saw this person slowly being tormented out of the company, and 6 months later they were gone. So as a result, I didn't come out to many, many years later, because that was one of the driving reasons why I kept my secret hidden, was because when I saw what happened to her at Interplay, and I saw it happen to other friends of mine in the industry in other places, that was always the same result. They would come out, they're greeted, but then upper management would slowly demote them or give them incentive to leave. And I did not want that fate to fall upon me. EA had a policy on transgender people. They actually had a written policy, and that was instrumental in me coming out. Because when I saw that EA had a rule that stated that if people discriminated against me, they would be the ones to be punished, because I'm just trying to do my work and live an authentic life. And if anybody was there at the company was retaliating against me, harming me, or doing anything negative against me, I would then be, I would be protected. And it is what gave me the courage, because I saw that at least it looked like on paper, Electronic Arts had my back. And while some people like to trash an EA, I will always be grateful for Electronic Arts that they had my back.
Again, this is not an endorsement of EA and all of its business practices, and that this is even the premier way that everyone else experienced EA, or working at EA. But that's what these type of resources provide us with: perspective. At this moment, there are very few resources like this interview, or others like it, or documentation, and all these other types of primary sources that are essential in understanding what it means to make a game. You might be asking yourself, who am I, then, to make such an archive and assume I know best about what it takes to make good game history? The only expertise I bring is almost completing a degree in history, and hopefully an open mind. I'm trying to read as many books and information that is out there regarding games history, but I haven't read it all. I've accumulated sources that I found to be helpful and I think others can get value from. I've interviewed developers when they've been gracious and patient enough to provide their time, but I will make mistakes. And I hope that those that come to the archive, whether that be people in the industry or those from the outside, will find value in this ongoing project, but also provide their own help, whether through their expertise or even just their time. This is that whole call to action moment. I hope you enjoy what I've done with the site. It's an ongoing project. It's not perfect. It's not meant to be. And I hope that if you find interest or find value in this site and what other people have done for gaming history, that you can provide maybe your own time or maybe resources that you found where they were useful.
Close your eyes, dear. The nightmares can't get worse than this. Close your eyes, my dear. The nightmares can't get worse than this.